The smell of wet cedar and salt is the last thing I remember before the lawyer's office went quiet enough to hear the ocean 2 streets away. My name is Naomi Castellan, and 11 days after my father's funeral, I sat in a mahogany chair that was older than my marriage, listening to a man named Mr. Gistang. Aldridge read a will that was about to turn my whole family against me. To my daughter, Naomi Rose Castellan, he read, adjusting his glasses. I leave the entirety of Wren's Point, the house, the boathouse, the 4 acres of coastal land, and all its contents. Nobody moved. Then my Uncle Desmond laughed, not a warm laugh. The kind of laugh that has a blade folded up inside it. That's impossible, he said. Read it again. Mr. Aldridge did not read it again. He simply turned the will around on the desk so my uncle could see his brother's signature in blue ink notarized, dated 14 months before my father's heart gave out on the porch he'd spent 30 years building with his own hands. I should explain something about Wren's Point, because if you've never stood on that bluff at low tide, you won't understand why a house could break a family in half. It sits on the northern edge of a town called Halbrook Cove, 3 hours from the nearest city, on a spit of land my great-grandfather bought for almost nothing in 1952 because everyone said the cliffs were unstable. They weren't unstable. They were just unwanted, the way anything unpolished and difficult often is, until someone loves it enough to prove everyone wrong. My father, Elias Castellan, loved it the way some men love a woman they were told they couldn't have. He rebuilt that house twice. Once after a storm took the east wing in the 90s, and once, more quietly, after my mother died and he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't grief. I'm an architect. I specialize in restoring old coastal properties, and I like to think that's not a coincidence. I think my father raised me without ever saying so directly to be the person who could finish what he started, which is exactly what my Uncle Desmond could not forgive. You understand what you're implying, Desmond said to the lawyer, his voice low and controlled in the way that frightened me more than shouting would have. You're implying that my brother, at 68 years old, cut his own son out of his childhood home and gave it to a niece he saw twice a year. I'm not implying anything, Mr. Aldridge said. I'm reading you his will. Beside Desmond sat my cousin Malcolm, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring at a spot on the carpet like it owed him money. Malcolm and I had been close once, genuinely close. The kind of close where you don't need to explain why you're crying. You just hand someone a tissue. But grief does strange arithmetic to people. It had been 3 years since Malcolm and I had spoken more than a holiday text, and in that silence, something in him had curdled toward me that I didn't understand yet. There has to be an earlier will, Desmond said. One that makes sense. One where the house goes to the family that actually built it. I built it too, I said quietly, and I regretted it the second it left my mouth, because Desmond turned to look at me the way you look at something that has wandered somewhere. It doesn't belong. You visited it, he said. There's a difference between visiting a house and being owed one. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. Desmond wasn't entirely wrong to be angry. I had only visited twice a year for the last decade, Thanksgiving and 2 weeks every August, ever since my divorce sent me chasing renovation contracts up and down the coast to keep my mind occupied. Malcolm had been the one who mowed the lawn every spring. Malcolm had been the one who drove my father to his cardiology appointments in the last 2 years, when I was 3 states away arguing with a client about crown molding. So when the will named me, the daughter who showed up twice a year, instead of the son who had shown up every week, I understood exactly why the room felt like it was tilting. What I didn't understand yet was why. The funeral itself is mostly a blur to me now, the way important days often are. I remember fragments instead of a whole. I remember that it rained lightly all morning and stopped exactly as the service began, like even the weather knew better than to compete with my father for attention. I remember Malcolm giving the eulogy instead of me, because I hadn't trusted my voice to make it through a single sentence, and I remember being grateful and ashamed of that gratitude in the same breath. I remember Desmond standing at the graveside with his hand on his son's shoulder and thinking foolishly that grief might finally be the thing that brought our fractured little family back together, instead of pulling it further apart. I remember my father's oldest friend, a boat builder named Otto, who'd known him since they were both 19, pulling me aside afterward and saying something I didn't understand at the time. He talked about that workshop of his more in the last year than he had in the last 10, Otto said, squeezing my hand. Kept saying he was almost ready to show someone. I always figured he meant you. I asked him what he meant by ready. Otto just shook his head and said my father had never been a man who showed people things before they were finished. Not blueprints, not boats, not apologies. He liked to hand you the whole thing, complete, so you never had to see the version of it that didn't work yet. I didn't think much of it that day. I had 100 other things pulling at my attention. Caterers, my ex-husband's awkward condolence text, my mother's sister flying in from a country she'd sworn she'd never return to. It wasn't until Mr. Klaas, Aldrich's office, 11 days later, that Otto's words came back to me and settled somewhere I couldn't shake them loose from. 2 weeks earlier, before any of this began, my father had called me on a Tuesday night and said something strange. Naomi, when you come up for Labor Day, I want to show you something in the workshop, the old one behind the boathouse. I've been meaning to for years. I never made it to Labor Day. He died on a Thursday morning, alone, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and the radio still playing the weather report for a storm that never came. I think about that unfinished sentence more than almost anything else from that year. I've been meaning to for years. What was in that workshop that he'd been meaning to show me for years? Desmond contested the will within a week. His lawyer's letter used words like undue influence and diminished capacity, which was almost funny because my father had beaten 3 doctors' predictions about his heart by nearly a decade through sheer stubbornness. And diminished capacity was the last phrase anyone who knew him would have chosen. But grief makes people reach for whatever weapon is closest, and a lawsuit was closer than an honest conversation. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, I had every legal right to move into Wren's Point and every emotional reason not to. But I went anyway because I needed to understand what my father had wanted to show me, and because some stubborn architect's part of my brain needed to walk through every room of that house and catalog what was mine before someone tried to take it away in a courtroom. The house smelled like him. That's the thing nobody warns you about, not photographs. Not letters but smell, cedar shelving, pipe tobacco he'd quit 20 years ago, but that had soaked permanently into the study walls. The particular mildew and salt smell of a house that has spent 70 years arguing with the ocean and mostly winning. I spent my first night there doing something I imagine every architect does in a house full of grief. I walked it room by room the way I'd walk a client's property before a renovation, cataloging what needed to be preserved and what had already started to fail. The porch railing my father had rebuilt himself the summer after my mother died, sanded so smooth it barely felt like wood anymore. The kitchen window that never quite closed all the way, letting in a thin ribbon of salt air no matter the season. The hallway of photographs that stopped, abruptly, the year my mother's illness made it too painful for him to keep adding to it, so that the last 12 years of our lives existed nowhere on those walls at all. I found myself standing in front of that gap in the photographs for a long time on my second night, wondering if that was its own kind of answer, if a man who couldn't bear to hang a new photograph might still find other quieter ways of saying the things a wall of pictures used to say for him. On my third night there, I found Priya. I should back up. Priya Okafor was my father's estate assistant, not quite a lawyer, not quite a bookkeeper, something in between, hired 18 months earlier to help him organize decades of property records insurance paperwork, and the tangled trust documents that came with owning coastal land that 3 generations had fought over before. I'd met her exactly once, at the funeral, where she'd stood at the back of the chapel and left before the reception. Desmond had introduced her to me afterward with a strange clipped tone I hadn't thought much about at the time. "That's Priya. She works for your father. Watch what you say around her." I hadn't understood the warning then. I understood it a great deal better the night I found her in my father's study at 11 o'clock, going through a filing cabinet with a flashlight, because Desmond had cut the estate's utility access before probate cleared, and half the house was running on generator power. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, and I meant it as a fact, not an accusation, but she flinched like I'd swung something at her. "Neither of us is, technically," she said. "The house isn't legally yours until the hearing's settled. Then what are you doing in my father's filing cabinet at 11 at night with a flashlight?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something I didn't expect. She turned the flashlight around so it lit her own face instead of the drawer, like she wanted me to see her clearly, while she said what came next. "I'm looking for something your father asked me to find 6 weeks before he died. And I think your Uncle Desmond has already found half of it and buried it somewhere I can't reach. If you've ever had the ground shift under a conversation you thought you understood completely, stay with me, because this story only gets heavier from here. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this one before it's finished." Priya told me the truth in pieces over the next 3 days, the way you feed a fire kindling instead of a whole log, because she said if she told me everything at once, I wouldn't believe her. Here is what I eventually understood. 18 months before he died, my father discovered that Desmond had been quietly taking out loans against Wren's Point for years, using the house as collateral for a failing restaurant investment in the next county over, one that Malcolm didn't even know his father had started, let alone nearly bankrupted. Desmond had forged my father's signature on 2 of the refinancing documents, banking on the fact that my father, in his late 60s and living 3 hours from any bank branch, would never think to check. My father found out by accident, the way people usually find these things out, a certified letter that arrived at Wren's Point instead of Desmond's address because of an old mailing error. He didn't confront Desmond immediately. Instead, he hired Priya, quietly, to help him untangle exactly how deep the debt went and how many forged signatures were sitting in bank vaults across 2 counties. "He wasn't trying to punish Desmond," Priya said on the second night, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a folder between us that she still hadn't fully opened. "He told me that. More than once. He kept saying, 'I don't want to send my own brother to prison. I just don't want him to lose the house doing it.' That was the sentence that broke something open in my chest because it sounded exactly like him. My father had never once in 68 years been a man who reached for punishment when protection was still on the table. So why didn't he just pay off the loans and end it?" I asked. "Because he didn't have enough liquid to cover what Desmond owed," Priya said. "The restaurant had failed completely by the time your father found out. Desmond was already 3 payments behind on a loan he never should have been able to take out in the first place, using a house that wasn't fully his to pledge as collateral. So, the will. The will was the only clean way out he could find," she said. "If the house passed to you, someone with no debt against it, no forged signatures anywhere near your name, Desmond's creditors would have no claim on Wren's Point at all. It would be untouchable. And your father was betting that if the house was safe, he could quietly help Desmond negotiate the restaurant debt separately, without anyone losing a home that's been in this family for 3 generations. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, I could hear the tide working against the base of the cliffs, patient the way it's always been patient, wearing down anything that refuses to move. Why didn't he just tell Desmond that? Why let him find out from a will reading, in front of a lawyer, like this? Priya's face did something complicated then. Guilt, maybe? Or grief she hadn't let herself feel yet. He was going to. That's what the workshop was for. The workshop behind the boathouse had been locked with a padlock I didn't have a key to, until Priya produced one from an envelope taped to the underside of a drawer in my father's desk. An envelope with my name on it in his handwriting, which she said she'd been under strict instructions not to give me unless the will was formally contested. If Naomi has to fight for this house, give her this. She'll need to see it before she can forgive anyone, including herself. Inside the workshop wasn't a hidden fortune, or a second will, or anything so dramatic. It was a scale model, nearly 6 feet across, of Wren's Point as it would look with a second, smaller building added near the boathouse. A design studio. My father had sketched it himself, badly, in the margins of old blueprints, then apparently spent 2 years teaching himself just enough carpentry to build a rough physical model of what he was imagining. Taped to the base of the model was a single index card. For Naomi and Malcolm both. A place where they can finally work on the same thing instead of fighting over what's already built. E.C. She didn't know it yet, the daughter standing in that workshop, but her whole understanding of her father's last year was about to change. The same way mine changed the first time someone showed me what quiet love actually costs a person. If a story like that means something to you, subscribing helps me keep finding and telling them. My father hadn't just been protecting a house. He'd been trying, in his slow and stubborn and hopelessly indirect way, to build a bridge between me and Malcolm before he ran out of time to build it himself. The will wasn't a rejection of his son. It was a life raft thrown to both of us at once, engineered by a man who apparently believes that if he built something concrete enough, literally, physically concrete, his children would eventually find their way onto it together. He never got the chance to say any of that out loud. A Thursday morning and a cold cup of coffee took that chance away from all of us. The hearing was still 6 days out, and I now had a choice to make that felt heavier than any blueprint I'd ever signed off on. I could walk into that courtroom and let the lawyers do what lawyers do, fight over paper until one side wins and one side loses, and Desmond, whatever his crimes, ends up publicly humiliated and possibly prosecuted. And Malcolm ends up hating me for the rest of both our lives. Or I could do something my father, in all his quiet stubbornness, had apparently believed I was capable of doing, and go to my cousin directly. I found Malcolm at the restaurant, the one his father had nearly destroyed him with, standing in a mostly empty dining room doing inventory on wine bottles nobody was buying anymore. He looked exhausted in this specific way people look when they've been carrying a debt that isn't theirs, and a father who won't admit he built it. "If you're here to gloat," he said without turning around, "you picked a slow day for it." "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because I found the workshop." He turned around then. Something in his face already knew what I meant before I finished explaining it. The model, the note. The 2 years my father had spent quietly trying to engineer a reconciliation neither of us had asked for, and both of us apparently needed. I told him everything Priya had told me. The forged signatures, the restaurant debt, the reason the house had gone to me instead of him, not as a verdict on which of us loved our father more, but as the only clean legal shelter he could find fast enough to keep Desmond's mistakes from swallowing 3 generations of family land. Malcolm was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing I hadn't expected, the thing that told me my father might have understood his son better than either of us gave him credit for. "I knew," he said. "Not the details. Not the forgery, but I knew Dad had done something with the house, something he was ashamed of, months before Uncle Elias died. I've been so angry at you because it was easier than being angry at my own father." That's the moment I understood how this ends, not with lawyers deciding who wins, but with 2 people finally telling each other the truth they'd both been protecting someone else by hiding. We didn't go to court. 6 days later, in Mr. Aldridge's office, Desmond, Malcolm, Priya, and I sat around the same mahogany table where this whole story started. And instead of a hearing, We had a conversation that should have happened 18 months earlier. Desmond didn't admit everything easily. Men like him rarely do. He started by repeating the same argument his lawyer had been making for weeks, that the will didn't reflect his brother's true intentions, that grief and confusion had been at play, that a niece who visited twice a year had somehow outmaneuvered a son who'd given up his own weekends for a decade. I let him talk. I'd promised myself I would on the drive over, because I understood by then that Desmond wasn't only fighting for a house. He was fighting to avoid admitting, in front of his own son, exactly how far he'd let a failing restaurant and a wounded pride carry him. It was Malcolm who finally stopped him, not with anger. I think we both had enough anger to last us the rest of the year, but by quietly sliding the forged refinancing documents across the table and asking his father to explain the signature that wasn't his own handwriting. Something in Desmond finally cracked open instead of closing further. He talked for almost 20 minutes once he started, and none of it was the version of the story any of us had been told. The restaurant hadn't just failed, it had been failing for 3 years, quietly, while Desmond kept refinancing against a house that was never fully his to pledge, certain each time that the next season would turn things around. He told us about the night he drove up to Wren's Point with the second set of documents, how he'd sat in his car in the driveway for 40 minutes before going inside, how my father had come out onto that same porch railing he'd rebuilt after my mother died and asked gently whether Desmond wanted to tell him something before he found out on his own. Desmond hadn't told him, not that night and not for months afterward. My father had found out anyway, the way he found out most things. Quietly, patiently, through a certified letter that arrived at the wrong address by pure chance. He didn't go to prison. My father's instinct about that had been right all along. A private settlement, brokered by Mr. Aldrich, restructured the restaurant debt against Desmond's own remaining assets instead of the house, protected by a legal firewall my father had spent his last year quietly building without either of us noticing. Desmond withdrew the contest of the will. Wren's Point stayed exactly where my father had placed it, in my name, untouchable, waiting. I won't pretend everything between Desmond and me healed cleanly that afternoon, or in the months since. Some things don't get fixed just because the truth finally comes out. Sometimes the truth only clears enough ground for the slow work of repair to actually begin. But he came to the groundbreaking in the spring, and he stood next to Malcolm instead of apart from him, and for a family that had spent a year finding new ways to hurt each other, that felt like more progress than I'd let myself hope for. The workshop is still standing behind the boathouse. Malcolm and I broke ground on the design studio this spring, a small, unglamorous building made mostly of reclaimed cedar from the old East Wing my father rebuilt after the storm in the 90s. Because it felt right to build our father's last wish out of the same wood he'd once used to rebuild everything else he refused to let the ocean take. I still smell cedar and salt sometimes standing on that bluff at low tide, and I think about an unfinished sentence from a Tuesday phone call I've been meaning to for years, and I understand now that some men say the most important things, not with their voices, but with the last thing they build. We finished it for him. That felt like the only ending he would have actually wanted.